Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're taking a look at a retro blast from the past, the 70s and 80s. This is a Wilkinson Arms Linda pistol. Wilkinson Arms is distinctive for having named all of its guns after the founders' either daughters or wives. Now, this originated in the story of this thing, its predecessors, go back to the late 1960s when Ray Wilkinson was in Azusa, California, running a company that made go-kart parts and accessories. So he was in industrial manufacturing, and right next to him, in sort of the industrial business area where he was located, was a guy named Robert Penny. Robert Penny owned a couple of companies, most notably National Ordnance, that did a lot of business manufacturing and selling M1 carbines and M1 Garands from parts, basically. National Ordnance was one of the first companies to produce a tanker M1 Garand. We don't need to get into the history of National Ordnance, but the relevant element here is that National Ordnance and Ray Wilkinson were next-door neighbors in business. And Wilkinson got the idea for basically this design of carbine, it hasn't changed much, put together a wooden mock-up and took it over to his next-door neighbor who was very much in the gun business to see what they could do about getting it into production. And the two of them collaborated financially and intellectually and formed a company called J&R Engineering that produced what was originally called the M68, which was a carbine form of this pistol. Originally, the M68 had a top-mounted charging handle instead of the side-mounted one here. They would update it to the M80 with a side-mounted charging handle, but all of this kind of came to an end fairly quickly when the Gun Control Act of 1968 set up the FFL system that we have today in the United States. Most significantly for this part of the story, it meant you could no longer mail order firearms directly. If you wanted to order a gun through the mail, it had to go through a licensed federal dealer in your own state of residence. Well, prior to this law going into effect, there was no such system, and so J&R had been selling these guns by mail order. You know, you send them some money and an address, and they'll ship you your M68 carbine. And of course, the change in this entire system of sales was problematic for them, and basically it put the company out of business. Now, they would come back just a couple years later as Wilkinson Arms, and that's where these guns come from. The first one out was the Terry, which is a carbine version of this. This one is then the Linda, both Linda and Terry being daughters of Ray Wilkinson. So let's take a closer look at this and see what the gun actually was, because it's better, I think, than its period advertising might make you expect. Very stereotypically 80s there. Markings on here are this nice fancy cursive script. Wilkinson Arms, this is a model Linda in 9mm Luger. They only ever made these in 9mm. Manufactured in Parma, Idaho. And we have our serial number over there. These were never huge sellers, but they were successful enough to keep Ray Wilkinson in business. Mine here has Velcro on the left grip because when I originally got this, it came with this gigantic, just so 1980s laser sight. This thing's like straight out of the original Terminator. I spent quite a lot of time trying to get this thing repaired to work again. That's why there's a hole cut out of it. Unfortunately, all the gas has leaked out of the laser assembly, and there is, as far as I can tell, no way to get this rebuilt. So I took this off of it, but the Velcro is still on the grip panel. The controls are pretty simplistic and a little bit small, actually. We have a magazine release right there, which pops out the magazine. This looks like a Browning high-power magazine. I'm told that you can get high-power magazines to fit with some adjustment to the release catch, but this is basically a proprietary magazine. They were available in 18 and 31 round capacities. This, of course, is a 31. The gun is a simple blowback mechanism, so we have a charging handle here on the left side and our ejection port on the right side. There is a cross bolt safety right here behind the trigger that is also very small. Doesn't have any red or white markings on it, just if it's pushed out to the left like this, that is the fire position. Pushed out to the right, that is the safe position. You can actually see from in here that this is a hammer-fired gun. So there's the hammer. There is an M16 or AR style of dust cover on it that you can snap closed, which is kind of neat. That automatically pops open. When the bolt cycles, the back edge of the bolt hits this little spring retainer lug, pops the thing open. The carbine version of the gun was called the Terry. It had, of course, a longer barrel with a barrel shroud on it and an actual shoulder stock. The Linda pistols just have a sling bar attachment at the back. On the top, the gun was fitted with a Weaver rail. It's important to note that this is not a Picatinny rail, although they're close in specification, just not identical. This is a Weaver rail, and there are a number of holes drilled and tapped in it to mount a set of iron sights. Because this one came with that laser that I showed you, I actually don't have the iron sights for it, so I just have a naked Weaver rail up there. One of the cool things about how these guns were designed is that the recoil spring and most of the bolt mass is telescoped forward in front of the chamber instead of being located behind it. This is similar to the Czech SA-48 submachine guns as well as the Uzi, but in this case it's done, well, it really makes it simpler to have a pistol version of the gun because you don't need to have much sitting back out here. So we can disassemble this pretty easily. We'll start by taking off the barrel cap, or the nut out here. Once that comes off, then we can pull out the barrel. Note that there is a pin here, and the barrel, if I can, there we go. The barrel has a little notch in it that lines it up with the pin. However, the barrel is fully symmetrical, so you have a feed ramp all the way around the perimeter of the barrel, or of the chamber. The notch here is probably going to make this a bit more accurate because in practice what that means is that the barrel is always lined up the same way, which means you can take the barrel out and put it back in and not have to worry about the barrel having been rotated, which would affect your point of impact. So, in general, these are quite accurate guns because they have fixed barrels. They're a simple blowback mechanism, and the barrel doesn't move and the sights also don't move. The barrel is effectively locked onto the frame where the sights are mounted. So nothing's moving around except the bolt, and that contributes nicely to accuracy. Now, to get the bolt out, we have to take the front of this off. There is a cut across this nut so that you can put a spanner of some sort across it. I'm just going to use this screwdriver and pop it loose, and then we can unscrew the rest of this. So this is a bit different from how the Uzi works, for example. In the Uzi, the front trunnion here is permanently attached to the receiver, and the barrel nut only holds the barrel in place. In this case, this threaded plug serves two separate functions. It holds the bolt and recoil spring in place behind it, and it holds the barrel in place up here. That's a kind of clever design. So once we have that out, then we just need to take the charging handle off, and then we can pull the bolt out. The charging handle itself is basically one big screw. It has a hex socket in the center, so I can pop it loose with a screwdriver, and then I can just unscrew it. There we go. It can help to hold the barrel, to put the barrel in to hold the bolt back while you're doing this, but you don't really need to. So there's the charging handle, and with that out of the way, the bolt mechanism will drop out the front. So you can see that the breech face is back here, along with the firing pin. We have a spring-loaded firing pin right there. We have a slot for an ejector. We have the extractor here and the pin that holds the extractor in place, but the vast majority of the bulk of the bolt is located forward. It needs to have this mass because it's simple blowback, and this will ensure that it opens slowly enough to be safe, but there's no reason it necessarily has to be behind the breech face. It can be in front like this. Like I said, this is common to the Uzi as well. Now, the other thing that they did, that Wilkinson did, was he put the recoil spring up front here, using the bolt itself as its guide rod. So instead of what most people do, what most designs do, where they have a guide rod or two guide rods on the back of the bolt, sometimes it's a small diameter tail on the bolt, but often you'll have guide rods with recoil springs around them. That adds extra parts. It adds the potential for the recoil springs to kink if you take them out. In this case, using the front of the full diameter bolt here is a pretty clever solution. There is a lip or a ridge right there in the receiver, and that holds the recoil spring. So you push this in until the spring hits that lip, And when the gun fires, this spring compresses to allow the bolt to go back, and then when it expands, it pulls the bolt forward. Now, there's a snap ring at the front here. You could remove the snap ring, and then you can take the recoil spring off the front, but there's no reason for us to do that today. One last element to take off is the fire control group. That is held in place by 2 hex screws. This wooden handguard here, by the way, is just a piece of wood screwed onto the receiver. There's nothing under it. All right, with these 2 screws loosened all the way up, we can pull out the fire control group. There go our 2 screws. And we have a nice, simple hammer-fired system here. So there's your hammer. You have a trigger linkage right there. There is a disconnect right here that prevents the gun from firing out of battery. The bolt would normally be sitting right there. So if the bolt pushes this down, pulling the trigger does nothing, which is important because this would mean that the bolt is not all the way forward, so the cartridge is not fully in the chamber, and it could be dangerous if fired. Once the bolt goes forward far enough to be fully chambered, then this bar is allowed to lift up, and then you can actually fire it. There is an additional feed ramp built in right there. The magazine catch is just a simple cross bolt, which you can see operating right there. So with the magazine in place, cartridge is going to feed out of the magazine, up that ramp, and into the ramp at the front of the barrel. This, of course, is our ejector. It will kick the empty cases out when the bolt comes back. And that safety that we mentioned at the beginning simply locks the trigger in place so that you can't move the rear components to release the hammer. Here's the receiver. Nice and fairly easy to machine. This is made out of aluminum, so it's relatively light. The bolt is the heavy part, and it needs to be so that it has enough inertia to open slowly enough to be safe. And I will also point out there is a little rubber recoil pad on the very back of the receiver just to cushion any residual energy from the bolt impacting the back. You don't want a steel bolt impacting onto an aluminum receiver without some sort of buffer pad like that. In fact, the barrel nut, the other barrel nut, and the fire control housing are all made out of aluminum as well. The only steel parts in here are the barrel and the bolt, but they are quite heavy by themselves and make the whole gun quite heavy. So there is the entire Linda pistol field stripped. Wilkinson would eventually move from Azusa to Covina, California, and then move all of his business operations up to Idaho. And that's where this particular example was made, as you saw. He passed away in the late 1990s. The company was purchased in 2000 and run until 2005 by Northwest Firearms. It was then purchased by another new owner in 2015 and went back to the name and logo, the original name and logo of Wilkinson Arms, and they still operate today, supplying parts and service and magazines and all that sort of stuff for these guns, because the design really hasn't changed very much. It doesn't appear to have been really any intention to re-engineer these guns. It looks like the current owners have put a little bit of effort into a couple different styles of buttstock for the Terry carbines, like an M4 style buttstock and an AK underfolder style of buttstock. But the core mechanical elements of the gun haven't changed. I think its primary appeal is that of its aesthetic. It really is a pretty darn accurate gun in my experience, just kind of awfully heavy as a pistol. In fact, we're going to go ahead and take a look at that tomorrow when I'm going to take this one out to the backup gun match. And as you noticed, I don't have sights, so I'm going to go ahead and stick a vintage red dot optic on it. This is a Weaver Quick Point. So we'll see how this does, because it certainly looks pretty awesome on the gun here. Oh yeah, that's an 80s blaster if there ever was one. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, stick around tomorrow to see how this actually performs on the clock. Thanks for watching.